stille nå, så jeg får filme at han bare sitter og ser en bølge. Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Right, well, I've explained what happened in the battle, such as it was, and then we were left behind when the Germans went up the valley, and I was left behind at Urya, and we found this hut in the woods. It's on the map, but I can't remember the name of the place. I couldn't remember. And I found this. We slept in the cow shed on something with 2 cows that kept us warm. And in the morning we went into the house looking for food, and we found the map which I've shown. Because I had no idea where we were. We were looking for food in the house, the 3 of us, and the owners of the house, 2 men came in, and I pointed out to the map to them, and I asked them to make a mark on the map where we were. And he made a mark, and I still have that map, and I've shown it to them today. We then, with sign, mind you, the Germans were only 100 yards away, just on the main road. We could hear them, so we couldn't go down to the main road again. So that we indicated with sign language, because we couldn't speak to them, that we could go in the easterly direction over the hill. And they told us which way to go. So we set off over the hill. It was deep snow. It wasn't easy going, mind you. And we came to Skard Farm, where Anne-Marie Hogue lives, the daughter of the farm now. In fact, Mr. Skard was very good indeed to the British troops. The whole company, my B company, I was not exactly with them at the time, were on his farm in a shed about 400 yards towards Tretton, and he killed a calf, killed one of his own calves, and took it to the men to cook for food for about 80 men. And also, he could not get his milk away, and he had to keep milking his cows, of course, if you're a farmer, you know about that. So he used to take his milk down, and the soldiers had the milk and the food. And it was very, very good of him to do that. He's dead now, but he lived to be about 95 years old, and his daughter, in fact she stayed here with us twice, I think, at least once anyway. She slept in the bedroom at the top where we looked at my slides today with her daughter. We know her very well, and she was the head school teacher, Anne-Marie Hogue, her name, H-A-U-G-E, I think she spells it. And she was a head school teacher at Urya School, so she's easily found, I'm sure. Anyway, we didn't stop at Skard Farm that day. We went to the farm higher up, further away from the valley, to the farm of Mr. Rindal. He's on the picture I have, but because he was away in the army, he was army the same age as me, but his father was there, and he gave us a very good food, and then had told us we must go quickly to the mountains because the Germans were searching the farms for, I don't know what for, probably soldiers or arms or something. So they took us to the mountain where his housekeeper was sleeping in a mountain hut. And the housekeeper and her friend came down to the farm, and we stayed in the mountain hut above Mr. Rindal's farm. In actual fact, in 1980, he took us again. The original hut has been collapsed, but it is used for the woodcutters in the winter And the interesting thing to me was there was a telephone line to this hut in 1918, a new hut that he'd made, and he showed us the base of the old hut where we slept. But the telephone line was interesting, of course, because it's for safety. If they could ring up each day to the house, because they sometimes, the woodcutters would stay for 2 or 3 days in the hills in the winter, I believe, cutting timber. We stayed about 7 days in this hut, hoping that the French remember the French were on our fighting the war with us in those days before Dunkirk. We were hoping that the British would come back and occupy the whole of Norway, and we could just come down and say, ha, we've been here a long time. Of course, that never happened. We hoped that the Germans just kept going further up, and then they took Otta. And after 7 days, I thought, well, we can't stop here indefinitely. I must try and get back to Andalsnes where the troops still were. So we set off in a northeast direction, and this day is the 24th of April. And set off, in the 24th of April, but it was very difficult going for us because we couldn't use skis, and we hadn't got any skis anyway. But even we got them, we couldn't use them. So we went to. I'm just trying to find here we are. We went to Glomansetter. And 1600 hours, and that is February the 1st of May. Then we went to Rolsetter and Stortland. By this time, we've been in the hills for long enough, and there were quite a lot of British troops up there, wandering around in the hills and getting hungry. And I decided I've had enough of this, and I'm going to the valley and take my luck with the Germans. So I returned to the valley to near Ringabu. I disguised myself with overalls. Wouldn't kid many people. The Norwegians knew who we were straight through. Look, you've got to look at our boots, which are different. Anyway, I got back. We got down to the to near Ringabu and slept in a barn, and then decided that we would travel along the valley at a lower rate to get back to Andalsnes. But then the first farm we stayed at for a drink of water was a lady who spoke very good English, and she said Andalsnes is evacuated and no British troops left in Norway, so where do we go? You either go down to the Germans or to Sweden. So I said, right, we're going to Sweden. So I had a map. I don't know where I got the map from. Somebody gave me a map, and we had to go over the hills to Vennebig, over the hills. We had to cross over a ravine, a very steep ravine, near a hydroelectric plant at Ringabu. We crossed it on a rope bridge, things like you see in the jungles of the Far East. But this was a narrow board, all covered in snow, with 2 frozen ropes. And we got over with great trepidation, I don't mind telling you. But then we got up towards Vennebig. We got to Vennebig, and the Norwegian captain gave us some food and some skis. It was very good of him because we couldn't. Because the snow was very bad over the hill. We're going to Emden in the next valley, on the road to Atna, and he told us to make for between 2 peaks. Between these snow peaks and follow the ski tracks. Well, we set off at 2 o'clock in the morning when the snow was hard, and the best we could, skied the best we could. It was good. It was quite good going downhill. I don't mind telling you. When we got to the peaks and going downhill, it was we got on quite well. We started off at 2:30 in the morning when it was just getting light, and we arrived at Emden in the next valley at 4 o'clock next afternoon. So it was 14 hours over those hills, and it was jolly difficult. Anyway, we made it. We then had to go down that valley to Atna, and we had to cross Atna Bru, which is a famous bridge, of course. And we were sitting on, there were 5 of us, and I decided there were too many in one group to get food from the farms. It was unfair on people to have to feed 5 men. So we were sitting on the side of the road sorting out our kit, and a man came over the bridge on his, a boy came over the bridge on his bicycle and said, I think it's Tuska. It's Tuska's the name. Tuska, in the station. I said, crumbs, you're telling us the Germans are here. And I said, well, I've come all this way to cross this bridge. I'm going, and I picked up my kit and ran over the Atna Bru. Followed by 2 of them, George Pemberton and Pemberton and Carr. I can't remember the name now, old age gets on. Still remember them. Anyway, they followed me across the bridge, and I've had several letters from the man who came over, and I've forgotten his name, but you can't remember his name, do you? It's on that letter I showed you. It's upstairs.
Yeah, I can't remember it now, but we'll.
Can you find it? Do you want to find it?
Yeah, it's upstairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's upstairs underneath where the slides are on the thing. We like to fetch it.
Yep.
Let's bring it down.
Well, he might still be alive, so he might be interested in it, mightn't he?
Yeah.
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 You cut it for now, have you?
Hmm?
You stopped it a moment.
Yeah.
Is it coming over all right?
Yeah, it's very good. It's looking very nice in this living room.
I forgot where we got to. Yes, we've got to Atna Bridge, haven't we?
Yeah.
And
Atna Bridge and
the man,
the boy coming.
the boy that came across to tell us about his name was.
Magne Kjølhamar.
I hope you got that, did you?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I can't pronounce a Norwegian name, but in 1990 I wrote to Atna and didn't seal the letter down because I knew the postman would open it, and told the story. And it so happened that the boy that came across the bridge to see me became the schoolmaster at Atna. And he was retired by the time it was 1990, of course, and we stayed with him for 2 or 3 nights and had a very good time. And he had a house right on the side of the river near Atna Bridge. And we had a very good stay with him. In fact, we stayed with him on the route to Sweden, and we stayed with him on the route back. Very kind of him. Anyway, we got over the river, Atna Bru, went into the woods, the 3 of us, and we went to the first house for a drink of water. And it was a station master's house, above all things. And the women were in the house, and they were very, very afraid. I've never seen people so frightened. And we looked out of the window, and lo and behold, the German troops were unloading a train just outside the house, and we were the other side of the house. So we ran. And we ran towards Hannestad. And at Hannestad, we stayed a night in a barn, and the farmer was very good to us. They fed us well, although it was a sover in Uthus. We often asked whether we sover in the house or sover in Uthus. And this was sover in Uthus. It was cold too. Anyway, he gave us a good breakfast and he guided us to Hannestad. where we met Winkelsgard, who was a schoolmaster, and he was very kind to us. He took us to the hotel. It's not a hotel now. Well, this is 1990. Of course, I don't know what it is now. And was giving us some food when somebody came and said, "The Germans are coming up the line. You better get going quickly." So we got going quite quickly. When he took us over, there was 3 of us, and that's him made 4, on 3 bicycles, and it was somewhat difficult. Don't mind telling, but we managed. We worked a system of what the farmers in ancient times in England, when there were horse days, was called ride and tie. When schoolboys were going to school with a pony, and there was only 1 pony and 2 boys, the boy would ride one boy would walk and 1 boy would ride the pony for, say, 5 minutes. Then he would tie the pony to a gate and walk on. And the next boy would come and untie the pony and climb on and ride. And my father used to call it ride and tie. I'm sure the Norwegians used to do the same thing. Anyway, we did that with the bicycles. We rode the bicycles and dropped them, and the next man coming along picked the bike up and rode it until we got to the next valley, and I forgot the name of that valley. What's it called? Osterdal?
Østerdal.
Oh, that is Osterdal. Yes. We got to the next valley, and they found us we slept in a farmhouse. Very good day, very good to us. The object of going, we couldn't carry on an easterly direction from there because the snow was too bad. We had to go in a southerly direction, but we had to go on the eastern side of the river because on the western side of the river was the main road, which was occupied by the Germans. So we could not walk on the road. We had to walk in the hills on the western side, on the eastern side of the river. And it was very difficult indeed. There were many, many ice-cold streams coming down the hills from the melting snow. And what we did, we used to take our boot, we used to get to these streams, and we took our boots and socks off, and we put our boots back on again, and kept our socks dry, so that when we got to the other side of the stream, you put your socks on and your feet were dry. You just emptied the water out of your boots and put your dry socks on. And that was a lot better than having wet socks. It's rather interesting, that is, you know. The way that we were taught in the army, well, I've heard it since in the army, and there's a man who went to Sweden with me called Sergeant Farley. And he lived quite close to where John Shepherd lived. He's dead now. I think he got killed in a motor accident, actually. Anyway, Sergeant Farley was crossing a river, which was very dangerous, of course, in those days. It was not an icy river. He took all his clothes off and wrapped them in his ground sheet and put them on top of his head, which, of course, is a sensible thing to do. You've got dry clothes the other side to put on when you get there. You soon dry off. Anyway, he stripped completely off, wrapped his clothes in his ground sheet, and put them on top of his head and walked across the river. Of course, he stumbled and he lost all his clothes. All his clothes went down the river, so he was completely naked except for his boots when he got to the other side of the river. Anyway, he rushed to a farmhouse. They helped him, dried him off, gave him dry clothes, and he survived the war. I met him after the war. So that's quite an interesting story. How to cross a river if you haven't, if you want to. But it was, the rivers were very, very cold, of course, and dangerous, and there were a lot of logs coming down. Anyway, we spent all day stumbling through this water running down in this valley, and we came to Mrs. Harmonton's house, of which I've shown you the picture. Mrs. Harmanson, whose picture is in the press at the moment, was 84 years old then, so that meant going back 50 years, she was, well, in her 30s, wasn't she? And her daughter was a little girl who was with us. She took her mother. There was a spare. They got a spare bedroom in this little house, and they took us in and they dried our clothes and put us to bed, and gave us a very good feed. But the Harmansons took a terrible, terrible risk. Their landlords and the neighbours dead opposite, and on the farm, which was in quite a good view of where we were Nazi sympathisers, at least the father was anyway, and he was actually put in prison by the Norwegians after the war. The family are all friendly now, and we've stayed with them quite twice, and we all had a very good time together. Because of the Nazi sympathisers with her landlord, they took a terrible risk with us. Anyway, and then we had to make it on the road going east from. It's near East Rendal, of course. I can't just remember the actual name of the village, but there's a suspension bridge over the river. The road to Glotvola was able to walk by walking, but it was not open to motor traffic. So we were reasonably safe along that road. And I got a map, you see, so I knew where I wanted to go. As we couldn't go over the mountains because we had no skis and no guide, we marched that 26 miles, 26 English miles that day, and that was a long time, a long route for us, until we came to the village of Glotvola. We went to the first house in Glotvola, and they didn't speak to us. We sat there for more than half an hour, and they didn't say anything. And of course, we were apprehensive because Norwegians were armed. They might have been Nazi sympathisers, although we never found any that were. Anyway, after about half an hour or more, the chairman of the village council came to us and took us to his house and fed us and gave us a bed for the night. And in the morning, I don't know the names, but I never got the names of them. And in the morning, he took us to the top of Glotvola Mountain. There's a radio station up there now, and pointed Sweden. So we shook hands, and he went and we went down. We started off. But that day was another very bad day because the ground between the top of Glotvola for the next mile was all swamps, and we were wet, absolutely wet through when we got to the next farm. Anyway, they helped us, gave us some food, and we slept in the barn. 4 cows underneath us on the hay, and the cows chewing their cud underneath. Our boots were so frozen in the morning we couldn't get our boots on. We had to put our feet in the boots and walk around with them as best we could until the heat from our feet thawed out our boots. Anyway, so we were only about 1 mile now from the Swedish border. The Swedish border goes through Drevsjö on the Norwegian side and Flirtningham on the... So I've got it wrong, haven't I? Drevsjö is on the Norwegian side and Flirtningham is on the Swiss side. But the lake goes between the two. So when we crossed over south of the lake, because we couldn't go on the road which is north of the lake because the Germans were manning the road, we could only cross in the hills to the south of the lake, and we ended up about a mile inside Sweden. before we were apprehended by some soldiers. They were friendly to us and gave us some good food and quite friendly. But they wanted to take us back along the road towards the customs house, which was near the frontier with Norway, of course, and we didn't want to walk that way because we said, no, blimey, you're taking us back, giving us to the Germans. Well, a Swedish officer came and said, no, we're not sending you back to the Germans. We just want to search you for arms, make sure you're not bringing any contraband, which seemed quite ridiculous to me. But anyway, the Swedes were very, very apprehensive. They thought the Germans might invade any moment, and they asked us a lot of questions about what we'd seen, but we hadn't seen any troops. Anyway, the Swedish customs men, we got my army paybook, which I still have. They stamped my paybook, entrance, Sverige, Sweden, 13th of May, 1940. When we were on holiday the last time in Norway, it was 1990, which is practically 50 years, well, almost 50 years to the day. I was coming from Sweden back into Norway, and I called at this customs house, and I thought it was rather amusing if I showed my army paybook, stamped 1940, and asked him would he please stamp an exit for 1990. So it looks like I've been in Sweden 50 years. I thought it was quite amusing, but the customs man didn't think it was funny at all. He just stamped it and left it there, didn't even ask me any questions about it. Anyway, that's another episode. We were taken then to Mora, where we stayed the night, and I met my friend Vic Pearson, Sugar Mike 5. He was an amateur radio, and it was due to amateur radio that I eventually, due to Victor's being amateur radio, I eventually got my ticket, because when we went and saw him in 1980, he said, right, go home and get your ticket and talk to me, and I've done that many times. But he died 2 years ago, unfortunately, and I now talk to his friend in Sweden. When I got my ticket, it must have been 1970, not 1980. I've got it all wrong. I'm 10 years out. That's old age. Age concerns, age or age related. That's what the doctor put on the death certificate. Anyway, we went from Mora then to Falun, and we put in an internment camp. A soldier in a fighting unit in a neutral country, by the Geneva Convention, is bound to be locked up or put in a camp. Your food and treatment is the standard of the country of which you're in. Of course, that didn't always happen with prisoners of war in Germany, believe you me, but the Swedes were very good to us. They fed us according to their standard, and we weren't doing very much. We were allowed out into the town. That was sometimes a bit amusing. We could go into the town, do the shopping. 7 men with a Swedish guard, and we would go out, and the Swedish guard got to look after us and make sure we returned to camp. Well, there was a shop in Falun which had a front entrance and a back entrance. Well, the soldier, he got a rifle and bayonet, mind you, and the Swedish bayonets are quite long, and it wouldn't go under the doors very well. So he used to wait on the pavement at the front, the guard him, and we used to go and do our shopping. But quite often we used to nip out the back and lose him. And then we would wait when we went back to the camp, we got to be in at a certain time, we sat on the side of the road near the camp when our guard came along. As long as he got 7 men, didn't matter who, whether the same 7 men, well, as long as there were 7 of us, we got back into the camp. So you can see they were fairly cushy. They were fairly cushy. and in actual fact, one day the telephone rang in the camp, and a guard came into the camp. Lance Corporal Berry, to the guard room immediately. Immediately. And that was me. I said, "Gosh, what have I done now? I'm under arrest." When I got to the guard room, they said, "Hey, you wanted on the telephone." And it was Victor Pershon, who's the man who was a radio engineer I'd met in Mora. And he said to me on the telephone, "Can you come and stay the weekend?" I said, "Well, I am under armed guard. I don't know whether I can or not." And so he said, "Well, I've asked the Swedish area commander, the general, if you can come." And the general said, "Yes, he can come." So they gave me a pass for 3 days to go on by train from Falun to Mora to stay with Victor Pershon the weekend. And then I came back on the Monday morning by train back into camp. And quite happy about that. It was very, so you can see, but they were reasonable to us. Victor told me, after he was called up for the army, in fact he was in the intelligence corps in the Swedish army. After the Battle of Alamein, they all stood up and cheered, because they could realise that then the Swedes didn't know which way to turn. They were very apprehensive of the Germans, and of course the Germans were running troop trains from Narvik through Sweden back to Germany, possibly soldiers in civilian clothes, I don't know, but they were running troops through Sweden in certain conditions, and the Swedes were apprehensive. They couldn't get them, and I've heard this on the amateur radio. I've asked my friend in Stockholm, who I talk to regularly, and he said that's just so. Anyway, another interesting episode we used to have a bathing party, and it was very hot weather, and we were in shorts for swimming, and they sent a soldier to guard us with a rifle and bayonet in full winter rig, and he was very, very hot, this poor soldier, and of course we were soldiers as well. And on the way back to camp, he took his coat off, and we carried his coat and his rifle for him. He's supposed to be guarding us, and we were carrying his rifle. and when they got to the camp there, we gave him his rifle back and put his hat and coat on, let him on, and he marched us into camp in good order. So that's how it was. Then it came to August. There were rumours about being repatriated. The Germans had some pilots in Sweden, and they wanted them back. So the Swedes said, if the Germans go back, the British go back. So they got the Germans to permit us to go by Swedish neutral ship from Petsamo in the north of Finland to Akureyri in Iceland. And the Germans, because they were controlling the seas in northern Norway at that time, gave permission for this neutral ship, completely lit up, because all ships were blacked out in wartime, completely lit up with Swedish flags painted on the side, and we sailed across the Arctic Sea to Iceland. We went, before that, of course, we had to travel to Petsamo. We went by sleeper train from Falun to Haparanda on the river. I can't remember. I think the river's called the Tornio. Between Sweden and Finland, then of course we had to change trains because Finland are a different gauge. There's a Russian, actually, in fact, that the Finnish railway, I believe, is a Russian gauge, because up to the revolution in 1917, Finland was an archduchy of the Tsar of Russia. So their railways are the same gauge as the Russians, and we had to change into the Finnish railway. Hard wooden seats, by the way, stopping every 10 miles for wood because they had no coal, to load on coal to keep the engine going. And they took us to Rovaniemi, which was the end of the line in the centre of Finland, and then by bus to Petsamo and to Akureyri. Okay?
Yeah. Is that
And right, well, then we got to Iceland, and that was a funny thing that happened. We were sailing up the field at Akureyri. Remember, the Germans had permitted us to go there, and if they'd stopped us, they couldn't. It was a Swedish ship. We were sailing up the field quite carefully when a gun fired and a shell came over the bows of the ship, plonk, into the water. It was the British Royal Marines. The messages hadn't got through to expect us to come. So anyway, they took us round to Reykjavik and we were back into the British Army. And we got home. And then after that I was commissioned. I became an officer. But that time, when I was in Norway and Sweden, I was only a lance corporal, acting unpaid. But within 6 months of getting back from Norway, I was commissioned second lieutenant, and I joined the regiment again, and we went to North Africa, where we fought at Kasserine, and many of the battles in Tunisia, Salerno, and I reached the rank of major. I was badly wounded on the 21st of September 1944 on the Gothic line. I was left for dead, but of course I'm here, so they picked me up next day, and I didn't. I was discharged. That was the end of me for the army. I was discharged medically unfit, and I still get a disability pension from the army, even at my age, because I'm not. My right leg is slightly deformed due to my being wounded. And I think that's the end of my story. So my correct title, of course, is I'm Captain J.D. Berry. I'm age 89 with the Royal Leicestershire Regiment. All the best to Norway. That's about the lot. Any good?